Last time we talked about demand and supply. Basically, we explained how it works. It's pretty much it's the most common diagram you will see. And today, what we can talk about is welfare economics, which it's theoretical the theoretical foundation for why free market is a good idea. Right? So we're going to present a very stylized argument that, based on the diagrams, that free market is good. Right? So how are we going to do that? So first, welfare economics is the field which studies how the allocation of resources affect economic well-being. How do you measure economic well-being? Well, we'll start with a very simple baseline: efficiency. What does that mean? That means that is there gains to be made without hurting someone else? If there is, then it's not efficient, right? Because you are not fully utilizing what you have. So efficiency means that if I want to make you better off, I have to make someone worse off. A lot of public policy would fall into that area, because if you want to use tax, like if you want to provide public healthcare, then you probably need to tax people in order to provide public healthcare. So you're transferring wealth from probably rich people into healthcare for poor people. So in that case, you are hurting one group in order to help another group, which by itself is not a necessary problem, because we do that all the time. Every government does that. The thing is, I think it seems like everyone can agree that if there is a way to provide healthcare without increasing tax, that would be even better, right? That means that's just a no-brainer. Everyone would agree that you should do that. And that can be seen by the fact that politicians in many places would claim that you can provide more without taxing more, right? So it's clear that people agree that if you can provide more without hurting someone else, then it's a good idea. So that's efficiency. It's a very low baseline in some sense, right? Because so we are benefiting one group without hurting another group. We're not saying anything about distribution, actually. We're just saying that, can you help someone without hurting someone else? So let's say you're in a situation where one person is very rich and everyone else very poor. And by the way, that's kind of how it goes in the world for most of history. Right? If you are a king, then you're rich. If you're a peasant, then you're poor. For much of the history of human, that's kind of the case. In that situation, if there's a way to make the king even richer, and without making the peasant worse off, that's still an efficiency gain, right? Even though the king might not need anything else, the fact that we can make him richer without making the peasant poorer because they're already so poor, it's also an efficiency gain, right? So efficiency gain is somewhat a very low standard. Unfortunately, it's very often the only standard that economics talks about. There are reasons for that, primarily due to the fact that, as I said, efficiency gain usually everyone can agree on. But once you talk about equity, then it's very hard to get an agreement. How much to redistribute is probably one of the biggest debate in politics everywhere. Like, do you want more? Do you want to help the poor people more, or should you allow the productive group of people, entrepreneurs, to unleash their productivity by lowering regulations and tax, right? So efficiency is a very low benchmark, but it's an uncontroversial benchmark. So that's usually what economists talk about. And we're going to use a demand curve with 4 individuals because that makes it easier to think about how you measure welfare. Now, we're going to assume that they each want just 1 unit. Think about a CD album, as I said last time. The reason why they just have 1 album is just to make it easier to calculate. So each of them want 1 unit, as long as the price is lower than a certain amount, right? So John is willing to buy one CD if the price is below 100, Paul is willing to buy one CD if the price is below 80, and George is willing to buy one if the price is below 70, and Ringo is willing to buy one if the price is below 50. And since John is willing to pay at most 100 for one unit, we call that willingness to pay. That's the most he's willing to pay. So we call that willingness to pay. If you plot the willingness to pay of all individuals participating in this market onto a diagram, then you get a demand curve. Before we go there, well, why would you be willing to pay a certain amount of money for an item? Obviously, if I point a gun at your head, then you're probably going to be willing to pay a lot for something that you don't value. But generally, if you are purchasing something out of your own will, then probably it means that it's something that's worthwhile to you, right? Why would you be willing to pay? Why would you be willing to pay $5,000 for an iPhone? Well, you must be better off with an iPhone and $5,000 less, right? That's because you're better off with an iPhone and $5,000 less. That makes you willing to pay for an iPhone. In other words, the iPhone gives you benefit that is at least 5,000, possibly higher. So the key takeaway from this question is that if people are purchasing things out of their own choice, this is a free market after all. If people are purchasing things out of their own choice, the price they pay should reflect the benefit they get. If you're willing to pay $500,000, that means the iPhone gives you at least as much benefit as $5,000. And if you're willing to pay more, that means the benefit is more, right? So if you ask a group of people how much they're willing to pay for an iPhone, you can pretty much get an idea of how much benefit they get from an iPhone, right? Some people would say, "Oh, I'm at most willing to pay $2,000." They must be not getting a lot of benefit from an iPhone, right? And some people are willing to pay more. But where do you get that information? Except obviously you can ask people. But if you want to get a rough idea of how many people obtain a certain amount of benefit from an item, where do you look at? The demand curve, right? If you know what's the demand for a particular item on the market, then that gives you an idea of how much benefit people get. So that's what we're going to use to measure. So as I said, we're going to put the 4 individuals' willingness to pay on the diagram, and that becomes our demand curve. Specifically, you can see that the first item, when the price is high, right, above $80, the only one that's going to be buying will be John. So he's the only demand for the item 1. As the item gets cheaper, more people participate, and so they start purchasing the item. So this is a demand curve, but at the same time, now we have another interpretation, is that it also represents how much people get from how much benefit people get from the item. Right? So graphically, how does that work? Graphically, as we say, well, if John is going to pay $100 for a CD, that means that he gets $100 worth of benefit from the CD. Well, this is probably some sort of a non-tangible benefit, right? Obviously, CD is for listening. Although it's possible that he's going to bring a CD and give it to his girlfriend or something, right? But in any case, he thinks that the benefit is bigger than $100. That's why he's willing to pay. So the vertical distance here measuring the benefit he's getting, right? So this is the first person. Then you have the second person whose Paul, whose benefit is 80. Then you have the third person whose benefit is 70, and the last person's benefit is 50. So the vertical distance here measures the benefit each individual is getting. And if you sum up the vertical distances, then you get the total benefit, right? So that means that the area underneath demand measures the benefit the consumers are getting. So that's the idea. We're going to use the area underneath demand. Or now you do have to subtract how much they're paying. At this moment, I haven't stated how much they are paying. Right? So consumer surplus is the willingness to pay, the demand given by the demand curve, minus the price paid. Minus the price paid. So what is the attractive feature of this? So let's say, just for example, if the price is $90, then clearly only John is going to buy, because we say everyone else is not willing to pay such a high price. So only John is willing to buy, and the vertical distance between what John is willing to buy and the price he actually pays is 10. So if the price is as high as $90, then we say that the consumer surplus in this market is going to be 10. Namely, this is John purchasing the CD, paying $90, which is $10 more than what he's willing to pay. If the price is lower, like 60, what would happen? Well, if the price is lower, then you have more people buying. John is buying, and he's paying $40 below what he's willing to pay. Paul is buying, and he's paying $20 below what he's willing to pay. And George is also buying and paying $10 below what he's willing to pay. So in this case, the consumer surplus is 40 plus 20 plus 10 equals to 70. Right? That's how it works. This is essentially how economists measure the benefit consumers get from a market. It's really a very simple concept. If you're willing to pay this price, it means that you're getting this is at least this is a measure of how much benefit you get. Let's subtract the price you actually pay. That's the extra benefit you're getting out of this market. So the attractive feature of this measure is that it only requires us to know the demand curve and the price paid by the consumer. That's very attractive because price is easy to observe usually, right? Price of an item is pretty easy. For example, for an iPhone, it's a fixed price, right? In Hong Kong, it's always sell for the same amount, regardless of where you buy. So observing price is strictly easy, especially in today's online merchants. Demand curve is harder, but it's not too difficult. You just need to do some marketing research, right? You can estimate demand. On the other hand, if you want to observe utility, that's a very difficult issue because first, utility is something that economists kind of created in order to write down theories about what people do. In people's mind, they don't actually, when they buy things, they don't actually think about utility, right? So utility is just a model. It's not really something that happens in your mind. So that's one problem. And even if we have some way, for example, like doing brain scan or something to get an idea of how utility translates to neuron activities, it's still not going to be possible to do a brain scan of many people, right? So, and you need, for a purpose of thinking about the whole market, you need some easy way to figure out the benefit everyone gets. So consumer surplus is easy because you just need a demand curve and the price. If you want to do utility, you need to go through every single one. So it's not really possible to do that. So this is very attractive. It's quantitative. It's measured by dollars, right? Money. It's much so it's very quantitative. You can add the benefit people get all the people get within a particular market, which is much better if you are then asking people, so ranking from 1 to 5, how much do you benefit from this item, because you can't sum up people's benefit that way, right? So when I say 1 and you say 5, it doesn't mean that you get 5 times the benefit I do. When you ask questions like that, ranking from 1 to 5, how much benefit do you get? It's just a relative scale, right? And so this is very quantitative because we're measuring in terms of money. So you could add up people's benefit. So for these two reasons, economists use consumer surplus to measure the benefit people get from a market. Now, well, as I just illustrated just now, when you compare a high price like $90 with a low price like $60, two things happens. One is existing consumers get more benefit. Lower price makes people happy, right? So in this case, John would earn $30 more in benefit because of the lower price. Second, new buyers, you have these new buyers, right? These new buyers weren't purchasing before, but now they are because it's cheaper. So lower price increase consumer welfare, which I think is something that should be really obvious in most cases. Right? Cheap prices make consumers happy. That's why companies go on sale. Right. So consumer surplus benefit measures the benefit consumer gets from a particular market as given by themselves through demand curve. So it's very easy to use, very attractive feature. There are some problems that there's some issues we have to consider. One is cases like drug addiction. Drug addicts have very high demand for drugs. So should we conclude from that drug addiction gives a lot of benefit to the drug addicts? Well, you might not want to go that far, right? Because we do know drug addicts who want to quit. The fact that they're willing to pay a lot doesn't mean that it's necessarily something that they find beneficial. Right? Here's the part where the rationality assumption is really questionable. In psychology, you would say people search on psychology, like you have this two-self model. Like you have you can call it a rational self and an irrational self, or you can call it a cold self and a hot self. Or you can also call it a fast self, a slow self, and a fast self. So this would be a terminology of the book Think Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, Nobel laureate psychologist. But in any case, in psychology, you have this common idea that there's sort of you have this two selves within a person, right? There's a rational person who try to be do the right thing. Like you know that you shouldn't spend too much money, you know you should save for retirement, you know you shouldn't eat too much, you know you shouldn't drink alcohol. That's the rational self. And then there is the impulsive, irrational self. Even though you know you should not eat junk food, when you see McDonald's or when you see ice cream, you just pray for it, right? Or drugs. Even though drug addicts know that drugs is not a good idea, having drugs, well, when the urge comes, and they can't resist. So in cases like that, you really want to question the rationality assumption. Should we trust buyer's preference in such cases? Probably not. There's also a second question: is that obviously consumer well-being is not the only thing you care about. Otherwise, we would be in a we would be easy, right? Just have everything, just set everything at a price of 0. Well, some countries have tried, it doesn't work. Right? It's just not going to work, because if you have a price of 0, no one wants to produce anything. So you need to consider welfare of the seller. After all, sellers, even if they are companies are ultimately owned by humans. So you can't just rip them off. That's something that's, as I said, well, maybe at some point in time, some communist countries do not realize that. So thinking that a price of 0 is a good idea, no, it's never a good idea. Right, so we're gonna do the same thing for sellers. So we're gonna use their supply curve essentially. We're gonna use the supply curve, which represents what we call the marginal cost. So the cost of producing an additional unit. So the supply curve tells you how much it costs the seller to produce an additional unit. So it's just like demand curve tells you how much additional benefit people get. Supply curve tells you how much additional cost it takes to produce something. And so with that idea, that the supply curve tells you, well, the seller's going to sell for $500 because it takes them $500 to produce. So if yes, with that idea, then you can get producer surplus, which is price minus supply curve. Right. Okay. So that's the idea. So let's say price is 700, right? Then the first unit, the seller makes $100 markup from the first unit, and then the seller 200 markup in the first unit, and then make 100 markup in the second unit. That's the idea. Once again, the attractive part or the attractive thing about this measure is that it's easy to use. We know price. It's not too difficult to get an idea of the supply curve. If you observe price fluctuations on the market, right? Prices are sometimes high, sometimes low, and you see sellers selling more or less. So you can get an idea of that, and then you can use that to measure sellers' welfare. In a lot of cases, economists working in the private sector would need to estimate demand and supply. So it's very technical because it involves a lot of statistics and data collection, right? But then ultimately, it's the same idea. Really, what they're looking at is looking for a supply curve based on price at different price level. So and then you just measure consumer surplus and producer surplus. And higher prices would obviously be a better idea for sellers because if you have a higher price, like 900. Then you would have existing buyers earning more, and then you would also have new sellers coming into the market. Right. So that's the idea. And then if you need to, so in practice, you usually have straight lines to make the calculation simple, and you will see that what you need to know is to calculate rectangles, triangles, and trapezoids. So I'm going to directly go to this one because this one I have drawn on the diagram already. So I just draw two very simple lines: 10 minus p, the demand curve, the blue line, and 2p minus 5, the red line, which is supply curve. This is a very typical demand-supply diagram. And let's say the price is 4. What would happen? Now, this is a case where the price is quite low, so what you have is the sellers are only willing to sell a limited quantity. And what we're going to assume is that whoever is willing to pay the most would get the item. So you can look at it as the best case scenario, right? In the best case scenario, limited items goes to people who want it the most. So that maximizes the benefit consumers can get from the limited quantity. If the unit goes to the people who want it the least, then it's going to be less efficient. And so this represents the best case scenario. So the buyers the buyers are willing to pay the price given by demand curve. This is something that they know, right? This is something that they know how much. When we might be able to observe that from the market, so how much people are willing to pay. This is what they actually pay, $4. So you have a trapezoid area here that represents how much benefit consumers get. The sellers get the area below the price, so the price is $4 here. The sellers are getting the area beneath price and above the supply curve. This is how much they earn from markup here, right? This is what it costs them to produce. This is what they're earning, so they gain a little. So this is a triangle. So that's why you need to know how to calculate trapezoid and triangle, right? You're mostly going to have diagrams and multiple choices. So but you should know how. This is something that even primary school students should be able to do. Right. The two areas added together is called total surplus, which is our measure of the benefit the society gets from this market. Right? By having this market, the society have gained benefit equivalent to the area in dollar terms. So it's equal to consumer surplus for producer surplus. Now, if you look at consumer surplus, as we have just argued, it's the value to buyers minus the amount paid by buyers. And producer surplus is the amount received by sellers minus cost to sellers. Since this is a free market, the amount paid by remind me tomorrow. The amount paid by buyers equals to the amount received by sellers. This is in the free market, right? If it's not free market, this would not be the case. In the free market, this is the case, which means total surplus, if you substitute in the equations inside, equals to the value to buyers minus cost to sellers. So now it makes it clear why total surplus is a good measure for benefit the society gets, because it's really just the value of an item to the buyers minus the cost to the sellers, right? So that's how you measure the benefit created. I can produce something for $10. You value that for $30. So I produce, give it to you, regardless of how much you pay. There's still a $20 benefit that is generated, right? Now, if I produce something for $10, right? If I produce something for $10 and I give it to you for free, you get $30 worth of benefit. I have a negative 10 because I have a $10 cost because I didn't charge you anything. In total, we have 20. If I charge you $10, then I break even. You get a benefit of 20 because you paid $10. And if I somehow happen to charge you $30, right? If I charge you $30, then you get no benefit. You break even because you value it for $30, you pay $30. But I earn $30 profit. So in the end, the society gets $20. So one thing to note is that total surplus is sort of constant, right? Total surplus, in the example I just gave you, it's actually constant regardless of the payment scheme. And it is the case here because you can see that the amount paid gets cancelled out. Because if you pay me more, then I get more benefit and you get less, right? So the actual transaction amount gets cancelled out. All it matters is how much you value the item and how much it costs me to produce the item. Right? That also means total benefit does not depend on price. It does not depend on price. So higher price benefits sellers but hurt buyers, lower price benefit buyers but hurt sellers. So that's not really the problem. What really the problem is, now, is how much we produce. If I'm producing 1 unit, then let's just assume you always get $30 worth of benefit from the item, and I always have a cost of $10, right? Unlike this diagram, which is sloped. But for simplicity, let's say you always get $30 worth of benefit. It always costs me $10 to produce. If I only produce 1 unit, then no matter what price I charge, it's always going to be just $20 worth of benefit being generated. But if I produce 2 units, then we would have created $40 worth of benefit for the society, and so on. And if I produce 3 units, then it's $60. So you see that the problem here is how much I produce, not how much I charge. The more I charge you, the more benefit I get, the less you get, right? But that's not a problem because it cancels out. The problem is how much we produce. And you can see that from this diagram. Since total surplus is the area beneath demand and above supply, the area gets larger as you get closer to the intersection. And what happens if you go over? If you go over, you have a situation where the cost is bigger than benefit. So you actually have negative total benefit here. So it's not a good idea because it's too expensive to produce. So what you can see here is that total surplus is maximized at the intersection point. So how do you arrive at the intersection point? Well, the free market would give you a market equilibrium at the intersection point. So we have the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics, which says that the market equilibrium is efficient. Because you can see graphically, if you want to maximize the difference between consumers' value and sellers' cost, the area that maximizes that corresponds to the market equilibrium. Now that's not saying that everything else is inefficient, right? It's just saying that market equilibrium is efficient. Something else could also be efficient, but market equilibrium is certainly one of them, right? So you can imagine if you have a very technocratic society that has perfect statistical ability, right? And somehow they can plan everything such that you end up here. Well, that would be equally efficient, even if it's not a free market economy. So there's nothing that says that planned economy cannot be efficient. It could be if you can plan it very well. The idea is that somehow, even though there's no one planning how much to produce in a free market, if you allow buyers to buy, sellers to sell as they wish, then you settle on a point that maximizes the total benefit the society gets. So that's the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics. That market equilibrium is efficient. As I said, it means that there's no gain in surplus without hurting at least one party involved. Government, from time to time, would try to nudge the benefit from one party to another. That's why you have things like rent control. Rent control should benefit renters and hurt landlords, right? So it's not free. Rent control is not free. You benefit the renters at the cost of the landowner, right? So, okay. Now this, if this theorem makes it sound like it sounds too good to be true, that's because there's a lot of underlying assumptions you have to make in order for this to work. First of all, you need competition. Clearly, you need competition. So in economics, the situation where there is no competition, we say that buyers or sellers are in a position to set the price, so dictate the price. If one party has the ability to dictate the price, then you would typically not result in an efficient outcome. Right? Because in many cases, in order to make more money, you have to give up some of your market share. Right? If I want to sell an iPhone, let's say an iPhone costs something like $2,000 to produce, $2,500, something like $250 US, right? I think slightly more than that now. It's more expensive than that now. But the iPhone costs a couple hundred US dollars to produce. Right? Apple is selling at a significant margin over cost. So technically, Apple would be able to break even at a much lower cost. And in fact, that if it sells at a lower price, it will still sell out, right? It will still be able, a lot of people would buy. So the problem is that doesn't make it the most money. If you're just charging a price very close to your cost, you don't make a lot of money, right? But that would be efficient, because efficiency depends on the value to buyers minus the cost to sellers the more and if you look at the diagram, as long as the cost of producing an iPhone is lower than the benefit the consumer gets from an iPhone, you should efficiency says that you should sell the iPhone, right? Like if the iPhone if the cost of an iPhone is $300 and the benefit the consumer gets is $310, it would be efficient to sell it to him. From the society standpoint, it's just not efficient from the Apple standpoint, because Apple doesn't want to sell an iPhone for $310. It wants to sell it for $500 or $600. So, but when you do that, that means anyone who's going to pay $310 will be able to buy an iPhone. So when you have sellers that can dictate how much you can charge for a product, then it's not going to be efficient in many cases. Well, that would already, so you already see in many cases, in many real-world cases, it would not. The first fundamental theorem of web economics would not apply, because cell phone. Well, then again, it's hard. As if you talk about the whole cell phone market, it's hard to say. It's not easy to say that it's not competitive, right? Even though Apple is very big, Samsung is very big, but you also have many players, and they're certainly competing on features, if not necessarily on price, right? So there is competition, but within the Apple ecosystem, then you're locked in, right? Then it seems like there's no competition. But there are many cases that there are actually no competition. Like in Hong Kong, if you live in, as we'll talk about later on, if you live in New Territory, so Kowloon, the only supplier of electricity is COP. There's no other choice. You can't say COP is too expensive, I want to use some other power supply. No, there is none. Right? Or things like in many cases, like if you live on campus, then there is only one supermarket, PARKnSHOP, up on the central campus. There is no other supermarket. There are many, so no competition. Okay, so that's one issue that we have to talk about in monopoly, is that once you have monopoly, where there's a seller who can dictate price, then this doesn't apply at all. And in general, monopolies are not efficient, which is why pretty much all countries and regions have competition law. Second, as we have mentioned about the case of drug addiction, you might not want to trust people's evaluation of cost and benefit, because buyers might underestimate the smoke of smoking, alcohol, and drugs. But it's also very important that sellers might underestimate the cost of pollution, right? In fact, you might not want to say it's underestimation. They just ignore the cost of pollution. If there's no environmental regulation, why would you care about the cost of pollution? In fact, even if you're a conscious person, you might be forced to ignore environmental concerns if competition is very intense, right? So this is topic in externality. So these are both monopoly and externality are big topics in economics, because it concerns cases where the market doesn't lead to efficiency. All right. So that's the first fundamental theorem. If there's competition, if you can trust buyer and seller's evaluation of cost and benefit, then free market is a good idea, right? So that already tells you. Next time you hear people say free market is a good idea, you should question whether these things apply or not, right? Right. So free market is a good idea. So let's not regulate. Let's reduce regulation. Well, that might not be a good idea, because once you reduce regulation, for example, environmental regulation, then sellers might ignore the cost of pollution, right? Right. Or in the case of financial systems, if you reduce regulation, maybe that the financial institutions would ignore the risk they impose on the financial system. So that's why it's not automatically clear that reducing regulation is a good idea. Right. There's another problem, is that is money a good measure to use? Within the economics course, we would not question that. Within the economics course, we always use money to measure anything. Right? But it's not, once again, it's not clear if you are looking from a perspective outside of economics. This is a very famous book, Michael Sandel, what money can buy, the moral limits of market. And this book is challenging the concept that you should attach a price to everything. Think about it, right? Think about it. When someone do something for you for free, you will feel grateful. Someone help you. But when someone decides, when that person say, pay me back this much amount, then it becomes a transaction, and it no longer have the same feeling, right? So once you attach price to something, it would change the nature and the people's perception of the item in concern, right? So what this book has is a lot of evidence, a lot of stories and evidence that once you have a price, people just treat things differently, very often towards the negative side, right? They just treat it, because once you treat it as a transaction, you no longer would have, people tend not to put in compassion inside the relationship, right? It's just a commercial transaction, right? We're just doing business. We're talking about business, so obviously I'm maximizing the gain I get. I'm going to get for myself. Right.
He came to our campus, right? He came to our school.
Yes, he did. Last year? Yeah, he did. Yeah, his talk was like completely sold out, like oversubscribed. Yeah, he came. He came. I think law school invited him. I don't think it's a social science faculty. I think it might be the law school or the human. I don't know. I don't remember. Yeah, but he did came. Yes, he did. Right, he did. So that's something that you have to think about. Once again, I'll say within economics, we would always accept the use of money and price as measured. But outside, and I would say in general, you should question whether that's a good idea. After all, this is university education. You should not just accept whatever the teachers say is a good idea, right? So, right. With that in mind, right? So the diagrams are very helpful in any case, because the diagram allow us to give us a benchmark. The benchmark is that, well, this is free market, it's really good. If you impose a government policy, how would it change the surplus? And it turns out a lot of policies you can actually draw on a diagram, and that tells us the exact change. So that makes it very easy to explain what the effect of policies. Things like tax, subsidy, price ceiling, price floor, quota, these are very easy to draw on a diagram. Tariff is, as we talked about last time, a tax on imports. So throughout the use consumers and buyers interchangeably, producers and sellers interchangeably, very often do that, as you can see by now. So tax. So once again, I draw this diagram. Just cross. You can use any. The map. We're not going to do the actual map. We're just going to draw. So the equation doesn't really matter. But you do have to, when you think about tax, you do have to think about, you want to draw it as a tax on buyers or draw it as a tax on sellers? How do you want to draw it? Well, I think here's the point where you should look at taxation in the real world. Is taxation on buyers more common, which means the buyer pay the government directly? Or is it more common to have taxation on the seller? Well, it's actually in Hong Kong, neither is really common, because we are free trade port. But if you come from another country where there is sales tax, do you pay the government directly when you buy an item? No, you don't, right? The seller includes the sales tax in your bill, right? So in other words, the money goes from you to the seller, and this is from the seller to the government, right? So typically seller pays sales tax. In Hong Kong, one of the few items that sales tax is gasoline, and gasoline the tax is charged by the gas station. Right, when you go in Hong Kong, gasoline tax is very heavy. So currently, gas is about 15 Hong Kong dollars, so that's $2 US, right? Out of that, 6 Hong Kong dollars is tax, right? So 6 out of 15, that's a lot, right? So that's how it works in Hong Kong. But why? Why would it be so much more common to see tax on sellers than tax on buyers? Because theoretically, there's actually no difference in the free market. But in practice, obviously, there is a difference. Now think about it. If you put yourself in the shoes of a government, which one is easy to do? Tax. Asking buyers to pay tax to you directly for every purchase, or charging sellers, right? You think about, okay, just take a case of Hong Kong for gasoline. How many cars are there in Hong Kong? Hong Kong is already relatively few cars relative to the population because it's so expensive. But you still have something like 500,000 cars, cars. And if you add in like trucks and vans, then you have probably almost 1 million, right? So if you have close to 1 million vehicles to tax every single time they fill in their gas tank, that's a lot of administrative work, right? How many gas stations there are in Hong Kong? Fewer than 100, right? So it's certainly a lot easier to deal with 100 gas stations than 1 million cars, right? So it's quite clear that in this case, administrative cost is a big concern. Another example, tariff, import tax. Theoretically, if you want, you could charge the buyers of foreign goods tax, right? Every time let's say in the United States, every time you buy a T-shirt from China, you're going to charge it. So, theoretically, yes. Practically, just too difficult, right? It's much easier to charge import tax for the amount of few companies that are importing goods from foreign countries. Instead, and you can quite easily control the flow of goods at the port of entry versus trying to charge a tax in every retail outlet in the country. So administrative cost is a big concern. Now, technology certainly has made it easier. Imagine one day every transaction goes through some sort of internet payment system, which is where China is heading anyway. Everything goes through an internet payment system. It would be quite easy by then for the government to charge tax directly on consumers, because in terms of programming payment system, it doesn't really matter if you are dealing with 100 versus 10,000 or 10 million, just the same course. Right? So in the future, it could change, charge directly on consumers, but right now, just for administrative reasons, it's going to be on sellers. So typically, you draw it as a tax on sellers. Right, so how does it work? If you charge a tax on sellers, then the seller's cost of production would go up. So the supply curve shifts up, which means higher price for every quantity sold. And the amount that it goes up reflects the tax rate, the tax amount. Now, the way I draw it now is parallel, which means it's a constant amount of tax, the constant dollar amount of tax per unit. This is like Hong Kong, where gasoline tax is always $6 regardless of the base price. But this is clearly not the way it works for sales tax in many countries, because it usually is a percentage. In that case, how would it look like? If it's a percentage tax, then it would look like this. This is the original supply, and this is supply plus tax, right? So that would be how it looks like. But the analysis is quite simple. It's just graphically different. We're going to use this one because it's easy to draw, but it's quite easy to do if you need to. Right, so, okay. So now, as I said, I've labeled everything to make it easy to see what's going on. And let's see. If you look at what happens without tax, the consumer gets the area beneath demand and above price. That's ABCD. If you charge a tax, then you lower consumer surplus because the new equilibrium is this big black dot. So this new intersection. So tax is typically a bad idea for buyers, right? It should be quite clear. No one likes to pay sales tax. Sellers. Right. Sellers get the area beneath price and above supply curve. And what do they get with the tax? Now, technically, what they get is the area beneath the new price, which would be higher, and above the new supply curve, which is also higher, so that's BE. But the area would not completely overlap with EFGX. So what do? Well, by high school geometry, B and E is actually the same size as H, because you have two parallel lines touching the same vertical line, blah, 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 so they are the same size. Right. So in any case, once again, you see that the sellers are getting a lower surplus, so sellers don't like tax also, which once again is quite obvious. But who benefits? The government. In this case, you have the government. The government collects a certain dollar amount from each unit. This is the transaction that occurs in the market. So the government actually gets this big black box of surplus. So if you add in the government's revenue, so then compare with these surpluses, then all total surplus is the whole triangle, as we know. The new total surplus, which adds up a new consumer surplus, new producer surplus, new consumer surplus, new producer surplus, and tax revenue that together gives you the new total surplus. That is still smaller. Graphically, you see that what we are missing is the triangle here on the right-hand side, D and G. Right. So this is a very typical analysis of a policy's impact on a free market. When the government imposes a tax, it hurts the buyers. As we see, from the group, consumer surplus goes smaller. It hurts the seller because the producer surplus goes smaller. It benefits the government because the government gets revenue, tax, how much you charge per unit, times how much unit gets sold. Finally, there is some loss in benefit here. Right? There's some loss in surplus. It goes to no one. What's happening? Why is there a loss in surplus? Once again, the reason is that there is it's always surplus. Surplus always depends on quantity produced. It never depends on price. It always depends on quantity produced. What happened is when the government imposes a tax, either the seller has to charge a higher price, or the buyers are less willing to buy. Right? Tax makes people unwilling to buy or sell things. So if they are unwilling to buy or sell things, then quantity transacted would go down. Some people who are willing to pay a low cost would not be able to buy. They're just not going to get anything. They're not going to buy. Now in the case of Hong Kong, right? You bet if the government eliminate gasoline tax, people would drive a lot more. Right? People do want to drive more. And obviously oil companies are willing to sell more. But the tax reduced, the volume transacted, which is the point. Very often, sales tax in many places are for generating revenue, but in the case of Hong Kong, the gasoline tax is not for generating revenue. It's to make people drive less. So sometimes this is the policy objective, the revenue. Sometimes, as in Hong Kong, this is the objective, to make you drive less, right? So, and this would be a good side benefit for the government, generate some revenue. Okay, so I'm just going to illustrate the supply and then we'll probably go on a break. Right, well, here's example version. So one of the most expensive tax in Hong Kong is the stamp duty you have to pay when you purchase an apartment in Hong Kong, when you real estate transaction. So real estate transaction in Hong Kong is subject to a baseline 4.5% transaction stamp duty already. So every time a real estate property change hands, the government charges 4.5%. Right. It's usually paid by the buyer, right? Usually paid by the buyer. The government doesn't specify who pays it, but someone has to pay it. Right? So it usually pays by the buyer. So 4.5 now, think about how expensive real estate in Hong Kong is, right? It's the most unaffordable city in the world by far. Right? So a typical apartment goes for easily over $1 million US dollars. Just for tiny like this size, right? This would be 1 million. This would actually probably be more than 1 million. Yeah, this road is certainly more than 1 million US dollars, right? Well, so the government charges 4.5% baseline. That's $450,000, right? 4.5%, right? Yeah. Okay, so $450,000. If you are a foreigner, or if you are a company, you pay extra. 15%. Right. So you pay 19. Is it 50% more? I think that, yeah. Is it in total 50% or 15% more?
50% of the profit.
Right. So it's 11.5%. Right. So that's 50% of profit transaction. So if you're buying a $1 million apartment, you're paying $150,000. $150,000, no, more than that, right? Which is 1 million, yeah, oh yeah, 150 million US dollars, yes. Otherwise, you're just paying 45, 150 million. Yeah, so it's a lot of money involved. So why did the government impose such a high tax rate? Once again, it's not for generating revenue. The Hong Kong government is so rich, it doesn't really need any of that. Yeah, it's one of the few governments who runs like that runs over a 10 billion US dollar surplus every single year, right? So that's, yeah, is it 10 billion? 10 billion is, yeah, 10 billion US dollar surplus, about right. Right, so the reason is the stated reason is try to cool the property market, right? Does it work? Well, right, so what does Chinese titles, you can look at the English one or Chinese one. So so what this says is that the top 10 housing estate in Hong Kong have seen a drop in transaction and a rise in price after the policy. So after government imposed the policy, well, I think it's, except for government officials, pretty much everyone agrees that the policy doesn't work as intended. Doesn't work because housing prices been breaking new records continuously. But if you think about the diagram, why would you expect price to go down with a tax? Right? Right. So if you think about it, I mean, in terms of the in the end, in terms of the actual price paid by the buyer, it's not going to go down, right? Now, here once again, I'm using the same diagram as before. We have seen that with a tax, you would have a higher price in equilibrium and lower transaction, which is exactly what you expect. Tax do not lower the amount people pay, right? Tax do not lower the amount of people that people actually pay off their pocket. It doesn't. So the only thing that it could achieve is reducing transaction. That if that counts as cooling the market, then it does work because people don't buy apartments anymore. But if you measure cooling down the property market in terms of property price, then it's not going to work very well. It doesn't have that effect. Right? So it doesn't work. But obviously, government officials would not say it's not working. Right? Hong Kong, unlike US, we don't have this rotation between different political parties. Right? Hong Kong is always the same party, namely whoever appointed by the Communist Party. Right? So you have continuity in policy. No one is going to admit that policy from a previous administration is not working. So they're just going to say it's working. Right. So we talk about the red area is called deadweight loss, which is a name that says that that's a surplus loss compared to the free market. Surplus loss compared to the free market. So that's why we're saying free market is the benchmark, is efficient. You have a policy, how much are you losing compared to the benchmark? Here. Because you have a reduction in quantity. So the loss in surplus is always going to be a triangle somewhere around here because it's driven by a reduction in quantity. It's relative to the free market. Right. So, okay. So I think we are almost at the 1 hour mark, right? Are we? Where did I put my cell phone? Never mind. So, how long is there? Oh, yeah, 1 hour. Yeah, we are at 1 hour mark. So, let's take a break now. So I mentioned that tax on buyers have the same effect as tax on sellers, theoretically. So if you draw a diagram with the same curves, and then instead I impose a tax on buyers. So this is a tax on sellers. This is a tax on buyers. If you impose the same tax, so you reduce demand by the amount of tax that the consumers have to pay per unit, the demand will go down. And you look at the change in quantity. I don't know, so this is probably okay. All right, just ignore this. Yeah, just do it. If you look at the change in quantity, right, it's the same as if you tax the sellers. So that's just going to be true, or it's mathematically true. If you have a demand supply diagram, if you charge sellers a tax, it's going to be the same as charging the buyer a tax. As I explained, in reality, charging tax is not easy task. It's administrate a lot of work. So in reality, it's not going to be the same. But if you just look at the diagram, then it's going to be the same because it's going to be the shift would reflect the same, would result in the same change. The observed price would go down only because we are not taking into account the tax paid by the buyers. Once you consider the tax paid by the buyer, the actual price they pay goes up. So here's what. So what sales tax would do is, it's true that if you charge the buyer a tax, they would be less willing to spend. But because whenever they spend, they have to pay more. They have to pay an additional amount in tax. In the end, the actual price they pay would actually be higher. So it's going to have the same effect. So I'm going to skip subsidy because subsidy is just a negative. Well, actually no. I said I can't talk about subsidy. But subsidy is just negative tax. If mathematically, subsidy is negative tax. Tax means I as the government tax you. Subsidy means I pay you, which would be the same as saying you tax me, right? Kind of you as a citizen tax the government. So it's just a matter of who pays whom. So subsidy is just a negation of tax. And as a result, in terms of diagram, instead of the supply curve going up, it goes down. Sellers are willing to sell more. Sellers are willing to sell more or at a lower price than before. Once again, I've labeled the whole diagram. That makes it easier to see what's going on. Once again, let's start with the consumers. Now the old equilibrium is here. So consumer surplus is the area beneath demand curve above supply curve. Above price. Above price, so it's A and B. With this subsidy, you have a new equilibrium. The new equilibrium gives us a bigger surplus for consumers. Right. So that's A, B, C, E, F, G. Okay. So subsidy makes consumer happy. That should not be surprising. Otherwise, why would any government impose a subsidy? Why would government implement a subsidy? What about sellers? E and H, the area that used to be below the original price and above the original supply curve, and the new producer surplus. It should technically be HIJK. But once again, it's equivalent in area to BCEH, which overlaps with ENH to make it easier for comparison. So the new producer surplus is higher, gaining B and C. So one lesson that you learn from these two diagrams, from tax and subsidy, is that you can never just benefit one party. Well, unless in some very extreme case. In most cases, even if the government simply wants to help, let's say, consumers, right? Let's say the government simply wants to help consumers. It's not possible to just keep the benefit within the consumer. Some of the benefit will be shared with the sellers. Why would that be the case? Because first there'll be higher transaction volume, and second, the fact that everyone gets richer would mean that they are capable of paying more, right? So subsidy generally benefits both parties, and tax generally hurts both parties, right? In some sense, if you think about places that actually give out cash subsidies, right, like Macau, right? And Hong Kong did that once, many years ago, 6 years ago. What's the usual impact, like, especially in case of Hong Kong? Because in Macau, it's $8,000 every year, so you kind of expect it. It's kind of like part of your income. But in Hong Kong, it's a one-off $6,000. What's the impact of a $6,000? Well, everyone gets $6,000, and everyone promptly spends the $6,000. And you can expect during that time period, sellers earn a lot more money because everyone is spending money, right? So government subsidy benefits both parties, buyers and sellers. Subsidy clearly is not free. So if you highlight the area, the government is paying this vertical distance as per unit. So the the horizontal distance is how many units get transacted. So this black box is the government's subsidy expenditure. So old total surplus is ABEH, the area beneath the old demand and old supply. New total surplus is the new total surplus, new consumer surplus plus new producer surplus minus subsidy expense, resulting in ABEH minus D. There is a loss of D as highlighted here. What's happening? This triangle is on the right-hand side of the original free market equilibrium. So as I just explained previously, this means there's overproduction. The cost of production is higher than the benefit. So it's inefficient to produce these units. What the government has done is that by providing subsidy, it's masking the real cost of the product. Right? It makes it look like it's quite cheap for the consumer, so they buy. Right? But actually, from the society's point of view, that producing those units are actually quite expensive. Well, now that, in general, I mean, if you, as I said, this is only bad. This is only bad if you think that if you believe the free market is doing the right thing to begin with, right? Now, if the government decides to subsidize something like an iPhone, right? Then you would have people buying. That might not be inefficient in the sense that Apple originally marked up the iPhone a lot, right? Even if the government pays for part of it, the price might still be higher than the cost of producing an iPhone, right? Let's say currently an iPhone is $700. The cost of production is only $300. So this right now is very expensive compared to cost. The government subsidized $200. It's still $500 versus $500 out-of-pocket cost out of the actual production cost of $350. So you're still on the left side, right? So that's why if it's originally, there are cases where it's originally not efficient. Government subsidy might make it more efficient in that case. But if originally you're already a free market where there's a lot of competition, then it might not be a good idea. Like if somehow the government subsidized you buying things from Taobao, then that would probably make it I would say that's probably inefficient, right? Because Taobao is already a very competitive marketplace. It doesn't need the government subsidy to make it more efficient. What would happen if the government subsidized people buying things from Taobao? But it would just accelerate people's behavior of buying goods that they do not really need. I think that's what's going to happen in Taobao. So another thing to notice is that there's this part where the supply curve after subsidy is actually below 0. That means, what this means is this, right? If you think about it. That means that even if the price is negative, the sellers are willing to sell something. Or in other words, they're actually paying you to use their products. Is that unreasonable? The sellers pay you to use their products? Now first, logically, I think you can actually imagine this happening if there's government subsidy, right? If for every unit I sold, the government is going to pay me some money, it's conceivable that I pay you to use my product so that I can get the subsidy from the government. It's conceivable that that could happen. And if you think of government services as a service, a product, right? Then that happens a lot. For example, think about social workers. Social workers don't charge people money to use their service, right? In fact, they actively look for people to help. That, in some sense, is a negative price. Not only you don't pay a social worker, you have the social worker actually approach you. Why would they be willing to do that? Well, they can only do that because the government or some charity is paying them, right? Their pay depends on them finding people to help. right? So that's why. So it's plausible. Sellers might be willing to actively look for buyers at their own cost if there's some sort of subsidy from outside. All right, so that's subsidy. Subsidy is expensive and inefficient because government takes a lot of money and there's overproduction. We're going to look at another form. So price in particular. We're going to look at price ceiling because subsidy and price ceiling are policies that developing countries very often use. Price ceiling, which means the government says you can't charge more than this amount. Price floor is the case when the government says you can't charge less than this amount. And quota means the government says you can't sell more than this amount. Quota is quite usually most common when it comes to imports. It's not very common for government to impose quotas within your own country. You might be saying, like in Hong Kong, I'd say you could imagine that things like like the number of university places is kind of like a quota but then it's self-imposed by the government since ultimately the government funds all university places. So obviously, if you look at the whole operation, whole higher education as one that is operated by the government, then it's not a quota because it's just, in some sense, government maximizing some objective they have. In Hong Kong, there's very little thing that get limited, but imports, a lot of countries have import quotas. Price floor, the government says you can't charge less than that amount. Once again, that's not very common because typically voters are consumers. You want voters to be happy, you want them to be able to buy things cheaply. So it's hard to see why a government would want to impose a price floor. That said, in Hong Kong, there's price floor on some product, and in all over the world, there's one particular form of price floor. What would that be? It pretty much exists anywhere. Minimum wage. Minimum wage is a form of price floor. It's a price floor in the market for labor, right? You're forcing buyers of labor, which are employers, to pay at least a certain amount. So minimum wage would be an example of price floor. Finally, price ceiling. Price ceiling is way more common. As we will see in an example, in many countries you have gas, you have fuel price ceiling, rent control. These are very common policies, right? Rent control would be a price ceiling. You can't charge higher rent. All right. So once again, diagrams. What price ceiling does? A price ceiling has this following effect. Since you are forcing the sellers to charge a low price, it only makes sense if you impose a price ceiling that's lower than the free market price. A price ceiling that is above the free market price has no effect, right? You can't charge more, you can't charge more than $50, but the market price is only 30, so it doesn't make it's not very meaningful. That's actually something that I think is happening in some that's a price floor on the next slide, but price ceiling, it rarely happens because it will be a useless policy. So you typically force the price to be lower. And what happens in that case? Once again, we were going to draw a diagram. Old consumer surplus is the area beneath the original equilibrium. So this black dot, you have this area A and B. New consumer surplus would be the area beneath demand and above this new equilibrium price. So this is what the government says the most you can charge. And as a result, now notice that this becomes a trapezoid because now we are quantity bound. The government, by forcing sellers to accept a low price, the sellers are not willing to sell a lot. So you have a trapezoid, this green area. All producer surplus is CDE, this triangle beneath price and above supply curve. New producer surplus is just E, beneath the new price and above the supply curve. Right, so what happens is price ceiling might make consumer better off. Now, it's not exactly clear that it's always going to be better off, because you can see you're going from a triangle to a trapezoid and they don't exactly overlap. It's possible that a price ceiling can make consumer worse off. Namely, if you imagine the government pushed the price really low, the shortage would make it, the shortage should be so severe that the consumers would be worse off under price control than without. Example, Venezuela. By forcing prices to be very low, there's severe shortage in everything people need. So they are certainly worse off than if there's no price control. So it does happen. However, a moderate amount of price control, like most rent control, because rent control usually limits you how much rent you can increase, right? So typically they allow you to increase something like 3% or 5% a year, versus in the free market you might go up like 20%, right? But then it's still something a difference of about 10%, which is not going to be very big, right? So as long as the price ceiling is not very severe, then the green area is going to be bigger than the blue area. So typically, for most price ceiling, it's going to be beneficial to consumers. But severe price ceiling, like the ones you see in places like Venezuela and some communist country, is going to be bad for consumers because of shortage. Venezuela is a very interesting case because it's self-inflicted. The shortage of goods is completely due to policy implemented by government. That's a very interesting case. Old total surplus, A, B, C, D, E, just the old consumer surplus plus the old producer surplus, and the new total surplus is A, C, E. So you're losing B plus D, which is the red area in the corner, as we would expect, right? Because by setting a low price, you force sellers to sell. So this is usually the policy objective, right? We want the price to be low, but this would be the side effect. Lower transaction. And you see that being more or less severe depending on the strength of the policy. Right. Okay, so as I said, one of the area in which policies like these get commonly used is fuel prices. The problem with fuel prices is that fuel oil, like fuel, like crude oil. Crude oil is an international commodity, right? It's a very tradable item. You can if you ship a barrel of oil from one place to another, people can just use it the same way. There's no differentiation, unlike a lot of our products. There's no description, right? There's no language barrier. There's no any sort of so for example, you can't just move electronic appliances from one country to another, right? Because of the voltage difference, right? You can't move food items easily across items because of regulations, and food goes bad, right? So, but crude oil doesn't go bad. Used the same way in every place. So fuel is a very internationalized commodity. But the problem is, countries have vastly different income. So citizens in poor country can hardly afford fuel with their income. But fuel is an essential commodity for a lot of places, particularly in developing countries, because they don't have good electricity supply. Right? In Hong Kong, we don't really need fuel if we want to. New apartments do not have any type of fuel supply, right? You use electricity for everything, but that only works in well-developed countries. In developing countries, you usually depend on fuel. But fuel is so expensive. So what do you do? So there are two things you can do. China uses price ceiling. Government mandates prices. They limit the degree of which price can be raised from time to time. Indonesia uses subsidies. I think in general subsidies are more common. Subsidies. Indonesia uses subsidies. So these both policies aim to lower fuel price for citizens. But since market intervention are always hard to carry out, both of them have side effects, and depending on the policy, the side effects are very different. So China, what's the side effect of subsidy, of price ceiling? Now China used price ceiling, and the result is shortage, right? Run out of fuel. Why? Well, the problem is fuel is an international commodity. The refiners, the oil companies and refineries in China can make more money selling their oil products overseas than in China because of the price control. So they choose not to supply the local market. Instead, they ship all their production and sell them elsewhere, resulting in shortage in China. Right. So the problem with price ceiling is you might have shortage. And we can see that from the diagram previously. When price is very low, sellers are not willing to sell.
But aren't those petroleum companies in China, they're
state companies, right?
Yeah, they're state controlled, so state should dictate certain quota. So
that's a very interesting question, right? I think there are two possibilities. One is not every company owns the whole production chain, right? Now there are companies that will mainly operate refinery, and in that case, it's not like you can just ship fuel from your own oil rig. If you're just a refinery, then it's too expensive to buy. Then you just buy less, right? It's more interesting certainly for the major state oil companies where they do own like oil fields. How come they are not shipping back? Well, it's hard to say, right? It's China, right? But I think that making a loss is also very problematic for your career, right? In China, after all, if you're managing a state company, profitability is the measure of your success. If you're managing a province, GDP growth is the measure of success. So maybe they cannot go into loss. Right? I imagine if let's say a central government impose a very strong order on saying that all these oil companies, you have to bring oil back, then maybe it could work. But I'm not sure. China is a very big market. Is it possible to make that work just by forcing oil companies to ship oil to China? I think it's going to be, and you still have the problem is that you have to you have to pay getting oil out of oil field is not a free enterprise. Most of the time, you don't own the oil rig, so you lease the oil field from the national government. Then you rent everything else. The oil rigs, all the equipment, engineers, they are all on payroll of some other companies, right? So you still have to pay those. So I think that's probably the reason, yeah. But in the case of Indonesia, then it's subsidy. Now subsidy means that Indonesia government just pay for the difference, right? It just import oil and then sell in the local market for a lower price. And what's the problem? The problem is budget it burns through budget. the Indonesian government spent 20% of its budget in 2013 for oil and electricity subsidy. Imagine 20%. Now, how much is that? 20%. Now, in Hong Kong, we spend 20% on. We roughly spend 20% of the Hong Kong budget on healthcare and 20% on education, right? That means you have in Hong Kong, if we want to do the same, we have to give up either the whole public healthcare system or give up the whole education system, right? So that's the cost of subsidy. That's the cost of subsidy. This is the reason why it grew so big is that this was during a time when oil price was going up very quickly, and politically, as a government, you simply can't raise price as quick as the international price. So that means that think about it, when oil goes from $50 to $130, that's over 160% increase in the subsidy expenditure. It's going to be a lot of money, right? So there is no perfect solution because once you decide you have to distort the free market in order to lower price, someone has to pay. One case, subsidy, government pays. But if government pays, that means ultimately taxpayer pays. The other possibility is to use a price control. But price control means that consumer pays because consumer would have to line up for fuel, right? In some sense, this could be more because it's interesting because if you think about it, when you need to line up, right? Who wins? Who wins? You're certainly discriminating against people whose time is very valuable. Right? Lining up means you need to waste precious time. In Venezuela, right? Their female labor force participation is very low right now, precisely because they need to spend so much time lining up for anything: water, bread, sugar, anything you need to line up for hours. So that means if you are so every family needs someone to line up for the whole day. And typically it would be a female. So female can't go to work for that reason. It's a waste of manpower, really, right? It's a huge waste of labor. Right. I do want to talk about price floor because this is what would be a minimum wage looks like. We're going to come back to minimum wage again later on. But for now, just imagine the government say that you have to pay a minimum salary, right? What happens is, originally, this is what the employer gets. This is the labor market, so employer is the buyer. This is what the employer gets originally. You force them to pay a higher salary, so they get less surplus. Okay, you force them to pay more. The seller, which is the workers, originally they get this area, D&E. With the higher salary, they get potentially more, the green area, right? Okay. Right. Once again, it's conceivable if the government forced the salary to be too high, it would just completely eliminate that industry. So that would be bad. But a moderate amount would benefit the workers. Though, all right, so salary would go up, but notice that employment would go down. So this is the argument against minimum wage, is that minimum wage in a free market would lower employment, right? The cost of unemployment. That's usually the argument against. Just within this diagram, you could argue that, if we don't care about companies, we just care about workers. The fact that most workers get a higher salary might be worth a slightly higher unemployment. You could argue that, right? There are, we'll talk about that in the future, is that there are other arguments that say that maybe that we don't actually reduce minimum wage might not necessarily even reduce employment. But in a free market diagram like this one, minimum wage would reduce employment. Right? So this diagram is essentially what people have in mind when they oppose minimum wage. Yeah, this is what it is. One thing that you notice, once again, is that you need the minimum wage to be higher than the free market equilibrium. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. And this is why I think in Hong Kong, minimum wage is not very meaningful right now. The minimum, even McDonald's pays more than minimum wage. How effective would a minimum wage be if even McDonald's pays more than minimum wage, right? So part of the reason why I think in Hong Kong is in such a where corporations have very strong influence on policy are willing to accept minimum wage is the fact that minimum wage are being set at a very low level, so low that it probably only prevent really extreme exploitation. Right. So let's see how much time I do have. Okay, so you have quite a bit of time. So I don't want to talk about quota because quota is just quota has the same effect. It's very similar effect as a price floor. It's very similar, but because it makes things very rare. By making things rare, they become expensive. So that's basically the idea. Make things where they are expensive. Right. So what policy should the government use? Let's say limiting the sales of cigarettes. If the government does not care about the welfare of consumers, producers, what policy is the best? If I don't care about buyers, I don't care about sellers, I only care about myself as a government, then obviously I want to use tax. If the government wants to minimize the harm to consumers, you might want to use a price ceiling. That's a very interesting idea. I think the Hong Kong government should try, right? You mandate that cigarettes cannot be sold by more than $2, something like that. You force it so low that it's not profitable. I think it's going to have a very interesting effect. Right now, the Hong Kong government uses tax. The problem is tax makes things more expensive. When things are expensive, you have smuggling. But if you force things to be very cheap, then maybe it will work. Who knows? As I mentioned, forcing price to be setting price below. When the seller has market power, so it's like as I mentioned in the case of an iPhone, right? If the government forces Apple to sell things cheaper, it could be more efficient. It could be more efficient. That's not necessarily inefficient, not efficient. And if the government wants to minimize the harm to producers, you will use price floor and quota. So that's why you have minimum wage, because minimum wage benefits the supplier of labor. Right. So the topic I want to talk about is, before we go today, is can we achieve equity? As I said, in economics, very often we just focus on efficiency. That doesn't mean that equality is not an important issue. So the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics says market outcome is efficient. There can be no gains in surplus without hurting at least one party involved. But as I mentioned, the case in which one person owns all wealth and everyone owns nothing is efficient. It is efficient because if one person owns everything and everyone else has nothing, the only way that you can make everyone else better off is to hurt that single one person. So efficiency is a very low benchmark for that reason. It can tolerate really bad distributions of wealth and income. So clearly no one likes to live in this situation, but it is efficient. So by itself, the first fundamental theorem would not make the free market a very attractive option. If anything, based on what we observe, right? Based on what we observe, free market tends to generate highly unequal outcome. So at this point, I think we're going to show a video. So whenever we say we want to do something, usually we mean some sort of policy, right? A systematic government policy, perhaps. So let's consider this very simple case. Sunil and Nobita both like remote control model airplanes. Supply of model airplanes is 2, and Sunil is over twice as rich as Nobita. What would happen in this case? If I have more than twice as much money as you do, there's no way you can compete with me at all, right? Since you just don't have enough money. So whatever you pay, I can pay more than you. So in this case, Sunil can buy both planes and Nobita will have none, right? So that's the way it is, because one person is more than twice as rich as the other, right? Is that an efficient outcome? The first idea might be, wait, like that's very unfair, but unfair is not the same as inefficient. Efficiency says that you cannot benefit one without hurting the other. In this case, when you only have two model airplanes, if both of them belongs to the same person, the only way you can benefit the other is to take one away and give it to that person, right? So it is an efficient outcome because nothing is left on the table. All the model airplanes go to someone. If there's a model airplane that no one owns, then that might be inefficient. But as long as everything desirable goes to someone, then that's efficient. All right, so it is efficient. So as an example, we're going to have a government policy sort of intervention, right? Doraemon presented Nobita with a new gadget called a wealth transfer machine, which gives all of Sunil's money to Nobita. Right, that's a typical. If you're not into anime, then like this is Doraemon. It's a children series which you have this mechanical cat that is like AI, right? AI. He has all these gadgets that do all sorts of things, like make you fly, and you can anything imaginable. So in this case, let's just imagine he has a gadget that transfer wealth from one person to the other. In a typical episode, you have Nobita would abuse Doraemon's gadgets, and he obviously is going to get all of Sunil's money away. And what would happen? Nobita can buy both planes, and Sunil will have none. Is that efficient? It is efficient. Once again, as long as everything desirable goes to someone, then it's going to be efficient. Right? So it's an efficient outcome. But then in both cases, you have a very unequal distribution. Can we do something better? Is there a middle ground? What if Doraemon used the machine to evenly divide wealth between Nobita and Sunil? What would happen? You have $5, I have $5, you are equal, so we have equal purchasing power. In that case, Sunil and Nobita can each buy one plane. Is that efficient? It is efficient because once again, there are two planes. As long as both planes go to someone, it's efficient. So it is an efficient outcome. Nothing is left on the table unclaimed. Right, so what do we observe in these three cases? We can achieve different efficient outcome by wealth transfer, right? We actually exhaust all possibilities in this example. We have two planes. In the first case, both planes goes to Sunil. Second case, both planes goes to Nobita. In the third case, they evenly divide the planes. So that's all the possibilities there are. And we can actually achieve all of them through wealth transfer. Clearly, some outcomes are more equitable than others. Right? Evenly divide would be the most equitable case in this example. This example can be generalized, and that would be the second fundamental theorem of welfare economics, which says that any efficient outcome can be reached through a market equilibrium with wealth transfer. So, free market, you can achieve equitable outcome through free market as long as you can redistribute people's wealth. Right? It's basically a more complicated version of what I just demonstrated. unequal outcome, unequal distribution, unequal distribution of things is a result of unequal distribution of wealth, right? Like, because one person has more money, the other person doesn't have money, then you have unequal distribution of things that you can buy. But if you can transfer wealth, make them more or less equal, then you can achieve an equitable outcome. And you still preserve the market because they are still buying things on the free market. So the second fundamental theorem of economics, together with the first, gives you the reason why free market is a good idea. Because first, it's efficient, so you're not wasting anything. Second, you can achieve equitable outcomes by wealth transfer. It's possible. These two together so these two theorems together are the theoretical foundation of why free market is a good idea. It's efficient, and you can achieve equitable outcomes through wealth transfer. Right? So that's the theory. That's the theory. So why let us not just distribute all wealth now? Like, shouldn't we just have governments redistribute wealth in a very hard-headed, strong-handed way? The problem is, in reality, distribution is not as seamless as you would assume in a theoretical model, right? In a theoretical model, like in the second fundamental theorem of economics, transfer of wealth is literally just moving numbers around. Minus X from your bank account and add X to my bank account. That's simple. But in reality, obviously, it's not going to be that simple. The first problem is the incentive distortion. Governments are not wizards. They don't have the ability to just magically transfer wealth from one person to another. Typically, what you have to do is you have to use tax. Whenever you have tax, you distort incentives. For example, in most countries, governments tax income. When you tax income, it reduces people's willingness to work, right? Because whatever I earned, I share a large part with the government. That doesn't make, and people might not be willing to take jobs that are difficult to do because you tax them. What if you tax investment income? When you tax investment income, people would be less willing to invest, right? They would be rather do something else because you're taking away their income from investment. If you use sales tax, it makes people unwilling to spend, as you can see very strongly in Japan when they raise their sales tax. The moment you raise sales tax, it's going to have a huge impact in consumption, at least momentarily. So whatever you try to tax, people will try to avoid it, and that's distortion. You're making people do things that they would otherwise not do. Some of them are more harmful than others, like income tax. Now, one of the very strong arguments for sales tax is that it would not distort people's incentive to work. Right? You still need to eat, right? And it's usually a virtue not to spend too much on consumption. So consumption, that's usually the argument for sales tax. But the problem with sales tax is it's what we call regressive. Because poor people spend a larger part of their income on consumption. Like, think about Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg. They can never ever consume all the wealth they have, right? Their consumption would account for a really tiny part of their wealth. So the sales tax, in turn, account for a very tiny part of their income. But for someone who have a low income, who is only barely getting by with their daily consumption, with their food and boarding, any sales tax would make it harder for their life. So, once again, it's very hard to find a tax that would be perfect. That's one problem, distortion. The second problem is the inefficiency. In reality, distribution usually involves a lot of manpower, right? And in Hong Kong, you have the whole social welfare department responsible for redistribution. So you need a lot of people. So these people are not doing anything. These people could be doing something else if you don't have redistribution, right? They could do something productive. Finally, whenever you have distribution, you usually have corruption. This is particularly a big problem in developing countries where government officials are supposed to distribute international aid. Very often, the aid goes to the pocket of the government officials responsible for the aid. What can you do? There's not much you can do in places like Africa. I mean, in Hong Kong and in like United States, at least you have a good legal system that prosecute corrupted officials. Not in Africa. There is no legal. In many places there is no legal system to speak of. So there's nothing you can do. Either you don't give aid, or you have to accept the fact that the government officials are going to benefit their own pocket. Right. So for these reasons, it's not easy to actually redistribute wealth in an efficient way. Very often it will result in large efficiency loss. So then you have to think about what's the trade-off, what trade-off you're willing to accept. Distribute, resulting in a more fair society, but you might not be as productive, right? Some countries clearly go for very high inequality in pursuit of efficiency, like China, right? As Deng Xiaoping said, right? Let a tiny group of people get rich first, right? That's the whole idea. That brings out the efficiency by accepting inequality. So Capital in the 21st century is essentially a book on these topics. The first half of the book is on the distribution, the history of the distribution of wealth. So it's really half economics, half history book. The first half of the book is pretty much what we call economic history. It talks about how wealth has changed, in some cases, from year 0 AD to now, right? So basically what you do is you try to estimate the wealth and income from historical records. So the first half of the book talks about income, and the second half of the book talks about what I think maybe brought back the last third of the book talks about policy implications. In particular, is there any way, for example, using tax that we can result in a more equitable society? One of the things that you would read if you read this book is that throughout human history, society has always been highly unequal. It's always been that way. Right? As I said, if you think about there's the idea of democracy, you have monarchies, right? You have very rich aristocracies, right? So it's always been very unequal. If you think about the video we just saw, it was talking about how in the 1970s, right, CEOs were only earning 9 times the income of the typical worker, whereas now it's 38. It turns out, well, it makes it sound like that back then that was the norm. Actually, no. From the 1940s to 1970s, that's actually abnormal in human history. And why was there such a period of abnormality? What happened to make it the society so much more egalitarian in that period of time? What happened? Well, what happens in the 1930s and 1940s? There are two things that happen there, essentially. In the 1940s, you have end of 1930s and 1940s, you have the World War II. Massive destruction of wealth. Who owns wealth? Rich people, right? So 1930s, you have Great Depression. Once again, huge crash in stock market. Who owns stocks? Rich people. Right? So essentially, the time period between 1940s and 1970s are highly equitable because there's massive destruction of wealth in the 1930s and 1940s. So rich people lose a lot of things, lost a lot, right? And then you have the subsequent rebuild of the society when an economy grows very quickly when you have nothing. So that provides a lot of opportunities for people to get rich, right? So, but then eventually, when in a couple of decades, your country would have recovered, and then you're back to normal. and then compound with technology, you make it highly unequal society is actually the norm in human history. So this is the Capital University Restructuring. This is an older book that there's no electronic version. This book was talking about a lot of examples how in modern economy, technology is enabled a highly concentrated, allowed a small group of individuals to be highly productive, right? For example, think about music performance, right? CDs, right? Once upon a time, if you want to listen to music, you can only listen to live performance. So there's more demand for live performance because there's no substitute. But today, you can buy CDs, you can download songs from iTunes, listen to Spotify. What stops everyone from listening to only the best artists and musicians in the world? Right? We don't need 200 good Chopin pianists, right? We only probably need 5. That's probably enough varieties already, right? 5. But in the past, you do because there's no digital, there's no recorded music. So we talk about things like that. And today you have televised sports events. So that's actually very obvious in Hong Kong because no one watched the local soccer matches. Everyone watched like English soccer, Spanish soccer because they are so much better. And you can watch today. You have live broadcasts. So that basically destroyed the local market. So this is what this book is about. If you're interested, I think you can probably find this book in the library if you want to. Right. So if you're interested in these topics, then you can read these books. All right. So that's all for